that maybe there's a signal for, maybe there's a signal not for them, probably not effective, but if they are effective, extraordinarily less effective than other drugs. So it's really unfortunate, but I do think that that's it's put repurposing in a more difficult light than it should be in.
Dr. Feigenbaum, there is a drug that might be helping against COVID, but it hasn't actually attracted any attention to speak of in the U.S. because it isn't widely used here. It's a very old drug. I think it's 100 years old. And that is something that is frequently used as a sort of an immunization for babies in many parts of the world where tuberculosis is common. It's called BCG. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, there's a lot of really compelling data around BCG vaccine as actually being able to be a very good preventive agent for COVID. And if you do get COVID, then have a much more mild version of COVID. I think the reason that it hasn't been taken up, it's a few reasons. One is that unlike dexamethasone, which is readily prescribable in any hospital or pharmacy in the world, BCG vaccine is not readily available, sitting right there in your pharmacy to be utilized. And then, so that's one part. It's not right on the shelf and easy to utilize. And then the second is that, here in the U.S., we have developed novel vaccines using RNA technology that is felt to be more specific than we've ever been before in terms of being able to basically 3D print the nucleic acid sequence of a portion of a virus. And so it's highly specific. And what you describe with BCG is less of a specific approach and more of a broad approach. And that's what, when you use the BCG vaccine to vaccinate someone, you broadly turn on the immune system. You basically get it ready to take things on. So it's just a very different approach. And you're right, it really has not gotten much attention at all here in the U.S.
Well, what fascinates us about BCG, and you probably can pronounce the French better than I can, Bacillus. Yeah, it's a French terminology, but basically it was
because the guys who discovered it were French,
and it was for tuberculosis prevention. But it was the first immunotherapy compound used against cancer. I mean, it was used. We actually had a dear friend who had melanoma, advanced melanoma, and she received BCG injections, 40, 50 years ago.
In 1975.
And it saved her life from melanoma. Nowadays, people who develop bladder cancer are routinely given BCG to treat bladder cancer, and I think there's a lot more excitement about BCG for these novel uses.
These are off-label uses for BCG, I think.
Well, I think now for bladder cancer it may be approved by the FDA, but the bottom line is, here is this really, really old drug that's being rediscovered against cancer and maybe even against COVID, and yet it points up one of the great weaknesses that we have, not just in this country, but around the world, and that is, how do we create a system that will allow for study and repurposing old drugs for new uses?
Well, you've brought up the exact question that I've been thinking about a lot ever since I discovered serolimus can be useful for me, and over the last almost 9 years, sort of digging into, why isn't there a system to figure these things out? Why did I have to be a medical student and find this drug? Why isn't there a system that's responsible for this? And I've learned that there's really 3 barriers that prevent drugs and approaches like BCG from being utilized for all the diseases they can treat. So one of them is that there's no central data repository of all drugs and all the diseases that they may be able to treat. That information is spread out across dozens of different places, from PubMed to clinicaltrials.gov through knowledge graphs. They're really spread out in a lot of places, which makes it really hard to find any one of them. Second, there is an insufficient business model. So I think that probably one of the main reasons that BCG also has some of the uptake that you described in new areas is that it's old, and therefore it's difficult to make a profit off of. And I'm not saying that is a a good reason that this doesn't happen, but I'm saying it is a reason this doesn't happen. So for drugs that are generic and old, it typically would cost far more to do a clinical trial of that approach than that company that makes it, usually multiple generic manufacturers, could expect to make back from this new disease indication, particularly if it's a rare disease. Now, of course, COVID is common enough that that actually may be common enough that it could actually be profitable, but there really isn't a business case for the vast majority of generic drugs and rare diseases. And then third, something that's really sort of surprising for me is that there's no organization responsible for figuring out all uses for approved medicine. So we often think that the NIH or the FDA would maybe be out there. I mean, when I was growing up, I had the sense that they must be looking into things, and I could envision this like group of collaborators working together. In my book, I call it the Santa Claus theory of civilization. I believe that there was a group of, almost like you can imagine, Santa's workers trying to figure out solutions to medical problems and deliver that solution to you just in time. But what I've subsequently learned is actually, particularly when it comes to matching drugs and diseases, there is no entity responsible for that, which is why we launched an organization this fall called Every Cure to take on that responsibility.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because I think that the fact that there's no central data repository is a really important barrier, but it's a problem that could be solved if we really wanted to do it. Under the current way that our medical system is set up, the fact that there's no good financial incentive for companies to do the research is a much bigger barrier, I think.
Do the research,
but this idea that there is no organization that actually is looking at how drugs are used. Tell us more about that, please.
Sure. So you're exactly right. It is a huge, intractable problem, but it is something that I think all of us believe is something that we should address. I mean, we call the organization Every Cure because we believe that no patient should be told that we've tried everything when there is a life-saving cure at the pharmacy, and that every patient deserves to receive a drug that could save their life if it's already at their pharmacy. And so through Every Cure, we're taking the approach of really trying to address these systemic problems. So first is building that database. Like you said, it's complicated and it's hard and will require a lot of people, and we're already building out that team, but it's not an impossible feat. In many ways, the algorithms that predict what video you're going to want to look at next on Instagram are the exact same algorithms that will predict which drug might be utilized in a new disease area. And even better than an algorithm is that a lot of these discoveries have already been made. So I mentioned the discovery that led to us saving my life, but we've actually discovered 9 more drugs for diseases that they were not intended for, one of which is a drug for cancer, angiosarcoma, where a study had been done 3 years before, back in 2013. It was in PubMed suggesting that a particular drug would be useful for angiosarcoma. But that paper, was buried in PubMed for 3 years, and no one did anything with it until that patient came to our center, and we treated him with a drug based on that paper, and he's now been alive for over 6 years.
Wow.
And that drug and drugs in its class are undergoing clinical trials for angiosarcoma.
And the drug's name is?
Sure, it's pembrolizumab, or Keytruda. There was a paper in 2013 suggesting that PD-1 and PD-L1 may be important in angiosarcoma, and this patient was given a 3 to 6 month prognosis because he had metastatic angiosarcoma. And all we did was look at PubMed. I searched on a simple database and found that there was data from 2013, 3 years earlier, and we did an experiment on his sample, on his tumor, and it confirmed what the paper said from 2013. And he's been alive and well ever since 2016.
Well, Dr. Feigenbaum, we've been very interested in what we have referred to as Coley's toxin. One of the first immunotherapies Dr. William Coley developed around the turn of the 19th century. Was it the 19th century? No.
Turn of the 20th.
Around the turn of the 20th century. And he was injecting basically bacterial toxins into sarcoma patients. And
to activate the immune system against the cancer.
He had an astonishing cure record. And then along came radiation and radium, and all of a sudden, nobody was interested in cholestoxin anymore. Nobody was interested in immunotherapy.
And of course, the side effects were significant.
Well, people developed a fever, and they got sick, but they were, in some cases, cured. And we still don't have a cure for sarcoma, although, as you've just pointed out, the drug that you found has been very effective for this particular patient. But it gets to the whole notion that we don't have a system, which drives me crazy. I mean, here there are literally dozens, hundreds of medications that might be beneficial, and yet there's no system in this country, there's no system that we're aware of abroad where we can break down the silos and get different doctors with different specialties interacting to say, hey, this old drug, it might work for fill in the blank, depression, cancer. I mean, there are so many needs that we have. I guess the real question for you right now is, what do we need to do in order to be able to advance this process? Because it seems like a no-brainer. There are so many drugs out there. What can we do? And we have just less than a minute to get a quick introduction to the possibilities.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. So we need to build this central database that's constantly searching for new drug disease combinations based off all of the new information being generated. So that's number one. Then we need to apply an algorithm to it to prioritize the most promising opportunities and work with government and philanthropic organizations and the general public to raise money to actually do the clinical trials, because we recognize that the business case isn't there for drug companies. And so we as a society need to say, well, we're going to take it into our own hands, which is what we've done for Castleman's and angiosarcoma and COVID. But it's to raise the money to actually do the trial ourselves. And that's exactly what we're trying to do through every cure.
You're listening to Dr. David Fagenbaum, Assistant Professor of Medicine in Translational Medicine and Human Genetics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. His book is Chasing My Cure.
After the break, we'll find out about drugs being used off-label.
Some estimates suggest that up to 30% of drugs are being used off-label. Without research, we won't know how to use these drugs effectively.
Dr. Fagenbaum's group is looking at 9 specific compounds. What are they?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
WNED Classical has been conducting interviews of their own on YouTube with the classical music community. Have you ever wondered what goes into the performances you hear on WNED Classical? Head on over to our Buffalo Toronto Public Media YouTube page to see the collection of interviews that we've orchestrated. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
Funding for the WBFO Health and Wellness Desk is provided by Highmark, Blue Cross, and Blue Shield of Western New York, our region's leading health plan.
Do you get the top stories delivered to your inbox every weekday morning? If not, that's because you're not subscribed to the WBFO Daily Newsletter. Go to WBFO.org to sign up for the WBFO Daily and get the latest news just as you begin your day.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia, offering its cardio health product with 500 milligrams of cocoflavanols in powder and capsule form. More information at cocovia.com.
And by Gaia Herbs. Their formulas are designed to provide an herb's complete array of beneficial compounds with nothing artificial. More information at Gaia, G-A-I-A herbs.com.
There are both benefits and risks associated with repurposing old drugs. How can we learn to harness the possibilities these medications present?
without causing undue harm.
Our guest today is Dr. David Feigenbaum, Assistant Professor of Medicine and Founding Director of the Center for Cytokine Storm Treatment at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Feigenbaum is the co-founder of the nonprofit Every Cure and author of Chasing My Cure, a doctor's race to turn hope into action.
Dr. Feigenbaum, as excited as we are about teaching old drugs new tricks, there have been abuses. And the one that comes to my mind is a brand name drug called Neurontin, gabapentin. And the drug company, at the time I think it was Parke-Davis, later acquired by Pfizer, was promoting this drug, which was an epilepsy medication, for a number of what we now refer to as off-label uses.
Maybe we should stop right there and talk about what off-label means, because it's a weird terminology.
Sure. It's really important to get all this terminology right. I totally agree. So off-label means that the drug was prescribed for a disease other than the diseases that the FDA put on the label. So sirolimus, the label is kidney transplant rejection, and we use it off-label for Castleman disease. So off-label means it's not on the label. And the last thing I'll mention with that is that approximately 30% of all prescriptions written in the United States today are for off-label uses.
And one example that people might be real familiar with is, for example, lorazepam, Ativan, which is an anti-anxiety agent. That's what it's prescribed, indicated for. That's on the label. But doctors sometimes prescribe it to people who are having trouble sleeping. So that would be an off-label use.
Exactly, and for nausea as well. Exactly.
Joe, you were in the midst of talking about off-label drugs when I interrupted. Can you pick up the thread?
I mean, the point is that a third, roughly 30% of medications are being prescribed for off-label purposes. And I think everybody's all excited about that. Isn't it wonderful? Except in the case of Neurontin, the company paid hundreds of millions of dollars in fines because they were promoting the drug for these indications that the Food and Drug Administration had not approved and the company had never tested. And so one of the holes is that we don't know about the dose when you apply this old drug for a new use. We don't know about potential side effects. We don't know a lot of information about how to use that drug effectively. And, what comes to my mind is ketamine. I mean, I love ketamine. I think ketamine is a fantastic medication. My professor of pharmacology, my mentor at the University of Michigan, did the first clinical trial on ketamine as an anesthetic. And Dr. Ed Domino wrote it up and said, hey, this is a dissociative anesthetic. And it's different and it's cool. And just be aware of what the potential problems are. Well, now there are dozens of ketamine clinics all across the country where people are injecting intravenous ketamine for depression.
Really?
Even though it's never been approved by the Food and Drug Administration for the treatment of depression. So there are pluses and minuses, but there's a whole lack of information about, well, are there any toxicities associated with that? What about the clinics that are now sending people oral ketamine, used to be known as Special K in clubs? What are the pros? What are the cons? How do we do this research around off-label drugs so that we can find out the benefits and the risks?
Yeah, I think you're asking all the right questions. And this, again, sort of gets back to why we wanted to create this organization, because no one is doing the work to figure out all uses for all drugs or figuring out what happens when people use the drugs in new ways. Because like you said, a lot of times repurposing, of course, is another term for this sort of concept of using a drug for a different purpose and essential intent. But when drugs are used off-label, there is no process. The FDA does not have any effort